Hi, and welcome to our 14th lesson and the final lesson in our study of the Acts of the Apostles. The last two chapters of this book, chapters 27 and 28, are going to cover the journey of Paul to Rome and all the things that happened to him along the way. It is a fascinating read, and I would encourage you to read it in its entirety when you have a chance this week. It happens in the early fall of 60 AD, 6061. They're going to spend 3 months on the island of Malta, and they're going to arrive in Rome in early spring, 61 AD. We're going to pick up in chapter 27, beginning in verse 1. It says, "When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment." Now I want you to notice Julius is actually given a name. He's not just a Roman centurion. As the centurion in charge of the imperial regiment, he probably would have been in charge of hauling grain back to Rome from the provinces where he was coming from. Watch his attitude change from first ignoring Paul's advice to then that of following his lead, and then finally even protecting him from being slaughtered by the other soldiers. Note also, by the way, that in this journey, this ship has 276 passengers, which may seem like a lot, but there are other examples of ships during the same era that had as many as 600. So, they're on the ship, and Paul has this first warning for them. He says in verse 10, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. So at this point, he doesn't believe him. He ignores his advice. Verse 13, it says, when a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the coast of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island, and the ship was caught by the storm and did not head into the wind. So we gave it up and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. And then they passed ropes underneath the ship itself to hold it together. It's interesting, a lot of the things that are said here are absolutely fascinating nautical terms and information that perfectly matches the time of at the time of this writing. In fact, it's some of the best information they have for how sailors did things like this in the first century. The boat the skiff, the small boat that they're talking about, would have normally been dragged behind the ship, but it would make it difficult to steer, and it might even have been crashing against the ship if the storms were small enough. So they took it aboard, and later the soldiers will use this same little boat to try to escape from the sinking vessel when it crashes onto the sandbar. And it says, because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. Verse 18. We took such a violent beating from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard to make the ship lighter so it won't be grounded on sandbars or rocks. And on the third day, it says, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. This meant that they were giving up any possibility of being able to steer the ship and were hoping simply to survive. Verse 20, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Well, they had given up, but Paul had not. But before we go any further, let's take a minute to consider a question in regards to this. No, Paul had not given up hope yet. Verse 21 says, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice and not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. The last night, an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me. Now, side note, this is the last of the 6 visions that Paul receives as recorded by Luke. And once again, it says the angel, quote, stood beside him, close quote. That's the same word, the same phrase as mentioned when Jesus stood beside him and when Ananias stood beside him. There is no mistaking that the author, Luke, intends to communicate that Jesus, as well as this angel, physically stood beside Paul. When they want to say it was a vision or a dream, they have a different way of expressing that. And here's what the angel said, verse 24. Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. Then Paul continues to the crew. He says, so keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. So, on the 14th night, Luke says, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. So they take some soundings to see how deep the water is, and it's getting lighter and it's getting shallower and shallower. So they know that they're heading onto land. But it's nighttime, so they can't see the land. Verse 29, fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. So they're trying to slow the ship down, dragging along the anchors behind them. In verse 30, in an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Well, without a port for the ship, the sailors thought that their best chance for survival would be in a small single lifeboat, unencumbered by 200 passengers. But then, verse 31, watch the difference in the attitude of Julius. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So Paul sees what's going on. He sees they're trying to escape under the pretense of saving the whole ship. They're trying to escape in the lifeboat. Verse 32, so the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. So by this time, the centurion believes Paul when he speaks up. The rest of the story, there's just too much of it here for us to read all at once, but I do strongly encourage you to read the story. It reads really well. You might try reading it aloud to give it the initial context of the story would have been read aloud in the churches. So you might try that. Verse 33, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat, and he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. And they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. And here's where it says there were 276 of us on board, obviously including Luke, since he's writing in the first person. So they beach the boat, but it breaks up on the sandbar. And verse 42 says that the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. Because, you see, in Roman law, if a prisoner escaped, the life of his guard was taken in his place. But now, notice Julius's reaction, now that he has come to know Paul and even to trust him. Verse 43 says, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. So he orders those who can to swim out, and then he orders those who can't swim to grab something to float on, so they all reach the land safely. Verse 28, once safely on shore, we found that the island was called Malta. So they get on the island, and the islanders are very kind to them. They build a fire, and they welcome us. And it was the end of October, beginning of November, so it's cold and raining, they say. So Paul gathers some brushwood, and a snake comes out of the brushwood from the heat and fastens onto his hand. The islanders immediately think this is divine justice. He escaped the shipwreck, but now it's come to take his life. So they conclude that he is a criminal. Then, when he doesn't die, they conclude he was a god. Verse 7, there was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after prayer, placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. I find it interesting that there is no mention of a conversion of the people of this island. They treated them with honor, they gave them the things they needed when they were ready to leave, but it says nothing about the start of church or anything in Malta, which calls to mind a question I want us to consider. So to summarize, they stay there for 3 months and then they put out to sea again on the route to Rome. So they go they go through Syracuse, Rhegium, Putuelo, then they come to Rome. It says that the brothers and sisters there had heard we were coming, and they traveled as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. So they're getting closer and closer to Rome, and those that want to greet Paul are traveling to meet him. At the sight of these people, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. Verse 16, when we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. Here we have Paul, who has committed no flagrant crime, and he wasn't politically dangerous, allowed to live by himself, to rent his own living quarters, though he probably had to pay for them himself, with a guard with him at all times, perhaps even chained to him. The first thing he does, as his pattern was, is preach to the Jews first. Verse 17 says, 3 days later he called together the local Jewish leaders. Now, why were there still Jews in Rome? Claudius had ordered their expulsion. Back in chapter 18, verse 2, Paul meets Aquila and Priscilla because they had fled from Rome, because it states there that Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. And here we have some interesting historical information validated by extra-biblical sources, because Suetonius writes that the Jews were actually asked to leave. Of course, Romans couldn't tell the difference between Jews and Christians because of their continual, quote, their continual tumults instigated by Christus, which is an atheist Roman's way of saying the news of Jesus was causing riots among the Jews. Well, the edict that Claudius had made had elapsed in 54 AD when he had died. So many Jews had returned to Rome with some of their own leaders and some of their own rules. Picking up again there in verse 17, it says, when they had assembled, Paul said to them, my brothers, although I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. They examined me and wanted to release me because I'm not guilty of any crimes deserving death. The Jews objected, so I was compelled to make an appeal to Caesar. I certainly did not intend to bring any charges against my own people. For this reason I have asked to see you and talk with you. It is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this chain. So, in saying this, Paul is letting them know that he is not the one that has brought charges against the Jewish. He is not the one instigating these legal proceedings, but it is the Jewish leaders. So they replied to him. They said, "We have not received any letters from Judea concerning you. None of our people who have come from there has reported or said anything bad about you. But we want to hear what your views are, for we know that people everywhere are talking against this sect." So they asked to hear Paul's interpretation, and Paul is anxious to speak with them before all the negative press that's on its way from Judea gets to them and poisons their mind against Christ and against Paul's message. And here's the interesting part, verse 23 and 24, and then a question. It says, "They arranged to meet Paul on a certain day and came in even larger numbers to a place where he was staying. He witnessed to them from morning until evening, explaining about the kingdom of God, and from the law of Moses and from the prophets he tried to persuade them about Jesus. Some were convinced by what he said, but others would not believe." Would not believe. Remember back in Acts 14, it says, "But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the other Gentiles." Or in chapter 19, where it says, "Some of them," speaking of the Jews, "became obstinate. They refused to believe and publicly maligned the way." And here, where it says, "Some of them were convinced by what he said, but others would not believe." Have you ever thought about that? That belief is not just something that either you have it or you don't. It's sort of, in the wind, whether you're the kind of personality that would believe or whether you're the kind that doesn't believe. That's not what these passages suggest. Is a belief is a choice. It's based on facts, but it's a choice. So here's a question for us to talk about. Well, Paul, when he sees those that reject the gospel, makes the point that he's been making all through Acts, and also a point that Jesus makes in his own ministry. Paul quotes Isaiah the prophet in verse 26. He says, "Go to this people and say, you will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving." Similar to what Jesus has said back in Matthew, when Jesus says, "This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand." Jesus there quoting Isaiah chapter 6. Paul also alludes to this fact in other letters, like in Romans. The theme of the rejection of the gospel by many in Israel has been an important one all throughout this letter. There's Paul also quoting Isaiah when he says, "God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see, and ears that could not hear, to this very day." So having preached to the Jews, as was always his pattern first, he turned to the Gentiles, and he says in verse 28, "Therefore I want you to know that God's salvation has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will listen." For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. And he proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness without hindrance. And there we lose Paul in the biblical record. We know traditionally that he was released and then arrested again when Nero began killing Christians in AD 64, but we have no word from the Lord on that. We know that as a Roman citizen, were he convicted, he would have been beheaded. But as Paul loses his life, as we all will at one point or another, it's not the great tragedy that we might think of. I think Paul states his ambivalence best in the letter to the Philippian church. He says, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I'm to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I'm torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far." This brings us to the close of our last lesson in our series on the Acts of the Apostles. I hope that you've learned something, and I hope that this study has been helpful for you. May God bless you and keep you.